So before I get started, I'd like to state that the views I express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve or the New York Fed or anyone else in the Federal Reserve system. So with that, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I actually learned this week that we have 8 countries represented in the audience, from Brazil all the way to Singapore. So thank you all very much for being here, no matter the time zone. In recent months, we've seen how shocks to our food systems are also shocks to our economy, that disruptions to our food supplies, whether related to climate events, geopolitical conflicts, or other crises, can have major knock-on effects that come with real human implications. This March, the United Nations reported that food commodity prices have soared to the highest levels it's ever recorded, and at the same time, it's estimated that the United States could spend more than $130 billion this year due to healthcare costs linked to hunger. Now, while the overall costs of hunger and food insecurity might not be fully quantifiable, we do know that the economic consequences are likely much greater when you consider how they impact educational outcomes, labor productivity, and ultimately gross domestic product. At a global scale, we're seeing this play out in real time as the war in Ukraine continues to push up global prices for wheat and corn. At a local level, we're seeing how the indefinite closure of a Buffalo, New York supermarket following a tragic event has become another tragedy in itself, leaving an already vulnerable community without access to healthy food and showing just how fragile our food systems are for many Americans. But there are reasons to be optimistic. Private and public investment in food systems is higher than ever, with innovations and business models that are proving to be both profitable and highly impactful. We can look to funding in food tech as an anecdote, which went from $60 million in funding in 2008 to more than $1 billion in 2015. So hopefully all of these things help underscore how important food systems are to economic resilience and productivity, which is of course what we're all here to discuss today. So this morning, we're going to hear from several domestic and international experts around these issues and opportunities. But before jumping in, I'd like to invite one person to the virtual stage who has been working tirelessly to respond to the evolving situation in Buffalo. And that person is Catherine Schick, who is the public relations manager for Feed More in Buffalo. So Catherine, I welcome you to the virtual stage here. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Dominic, and it is a real honor to be with all of you today. And thank you for taking the time to have this important event and look at how food insecurity and economic resiliency do go hand in hand. So we really appreciate that. I was asked to come on, and of course, welcome to the opportunity to take a moment to talk a little bit about what we are doing here in Buffalo, New York, and what we are seeing as a result of the horrific events that took place in our community on May 14th when we experienced a mass shooting at the Tops supermarket on Jefferson Avenue. Beyond the trauma, the sadness, the loss of life that occurred on that horrific day, so many of our community members who are also already in a vulnerable position, as Dominic mentioned, also were thrust into even more challenges because they lost their main grocery store, the only grocery store that they would rely on, making that community even more of a food desert, or as many people refer to it in the hunger relief organization, food apartheid. So at Feed More Western New York, we are a hunger relief organization serving 4 counties. We serve Niagara, Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, and Erie County, which houses Buffalo, New York. We have been working in partnership with the County of Erie, the City of Buffalo, and many of our local partners in the hunger relief arena, as well as national partners. And I know Feeding America is on the call with us today, to make sure that we are engaged in this response effort and making sure that our community members do not have to go hungry during this time. So we have been holding 2 daily emergency food distributions in our community, one at the Resource Council of Western New York and one at the Johnny B. Wiley Pavilion, both in the neighborhoods that were actually affected by most directly by these recent events. So we are distributing food each day through those emergency food distributions, and we are also working to connect individuals with our other feeding programs and with our agencies of food pantries, soup kitchens, and other feeding programs in the community to make sure that they are supported, you know, in the immediate terms and in the near future. So right now, our distributions are poised to continue until this Sunday, at which point we're working with many of our other community partners and government partners to talk about a longer term strategy for those combination of emergency food distributions and other resources as we figure out a plan going forward to address the food insecurity in the region. But I do want to point out that this is not anything new for our community. Unfortunately, the events of May 14th created a brand new tragedy and many challenges that we are now facing. But food insecurity had been a part of our community and the fabric of our community for a very long time. Feed More Western New York actually served over 12.8 million meals last year alone. And according to Feeding America, we were projected to face about have nearly 175,000 individuals in our service area struggle with food insecurity last year. In the zip code where that tops was experienced that mass shooting, over 1,700 individuals actually were and projected to have experienced food insecurity. So a nearly 17% rate of food insecurity in that zip code alone. So certainly we have been experiencing many people struggling to make ends meet, many people trying to have to make tough choices. Do I put gas in my car, or do I actually, you know, be able to go to the grocery store when that grocery store was open to feed my family? So these problems will continue, and we do need to work on addressing them, you know, on a local level, on a national level, and an international level if we are going to really alleviate food insecurity in our community, our nation, and our world.
Thank you, Catherine. I know you have a very full plate right now, so we appreciate you taking the time to speak to the efforts happening in Buffalo. If there are people in the audience who would like to get involved and help support these efforts, whether with Food More or in broader Buffalo, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to put you in touch with Catherine directly and her team. So thanks again. Um, shifting gears now, I would like to move into our first panel discussion, focus on global perspectives, which will be led by Pradama Singh, who is joining us from Economist Impact. And Pradama is the principal of policy and insights for Economist Impact and is really leading the effort behind the Global Food Security Index, which is in its 10th year and is ranking countries based on a lot of different metrics that she will share shortly. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Dominic, for the warm welcome, and thanks, Catherine, for really showing us really how we can sort of move from a really tragic event to something that brings us together and really just focus on the core here. So really appreciate you sharing the tremendous work that you're doing on the ground. So thanks for that. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. As you know, food insecurity and just the conversation on food systems has been top of mind and really sort of in focus in the past few months. But we at Economist Impact, which is part of the Economist Group, have been talking about this and trying to raise awareness of the global food security situation for over 10 years now. And what I'm going to do today very quickly is to really just lay the groundwork for what we do, the global food security situation, as measured through our index, which is the Global Food Security Index, and really talk through a little bit about what we've seen internationally, what's going on, what countries are doing well, what we've learned in the past 10 years, and narrow in a little bit about on how the US is performing in the index as well. So just to kick us off, the Global Food Security Index is an index that we conduct at the Economist Impact, that we've sort of created and collect data for every year. It's an annual index that really looks at measuring the drivers of food security or lack thereof globally across 113 countries. We started this index back in 2012, and so in 2021 we had our 10th year index, and we are looking ahead and continuing to measure food insecurity going forward this year as well. The aim of the index is really to provide a set of best practices, a tool essentially to enable policymakers, global, international, multilateral organizations, and governments as well, on understanding the food security situation, but more importantly, examining those drivers and exploring how they can use this tool, this index, to really draw out a roadmap to achieve food security for their populations. How we do this, we at Economist Impact do believe that we can only manage what we measure. And so the first thing that we're trying to do using this particular index is try and measure food insecurity or the enabling environment for food security across different countries. And we do this by categorizing our index into 4 pillars, starting with affordability, availability, quality and safety, and then natural resources and resilience. Now, essentially, the way this framework was developed was using the Foods Convention back in '96, and using that definition, which is food security is when we achieve affordable food that's available and accessible, that's also healthy and nutritious for our populations. And back in 2020, we incorporated our adjustment factor category, which was natural resources and resilience, into the main index, because it was critical that we think through how resilient our food systems are, but also how food and climate risk are no longer two separate issues. We need to be able to link them and have them join that dialogue on talking about food security. And so we incorporated this 4th category into the main index in 2020. And essentially what we're trying to sort of think through are what are those drivers within each of these pillars, indicators, sub-indicators, that allow us to think through how that, using some of those levers, how some of those tools and I guess enabling changes can allow us to achieve, or at least aspire to achieve, food security. I'm going to share a little bit about what we've learned so far and key trends that we've seen in the past 10 years. And starting with the overall environment, you can see on your screens here that the overall food security environment, this is the overall score, average score for 113 countries from 2012 to 2021. What's really interesting is on this bar chart, you can see as well, we made steady gains in the overall food environment between 2012 and 2019. So small incremental growth, of course, but small incremental improvements all the way from 57.2 through to 61.6 in 2019. But what is sort of scary, or something that we're watching very closely, is that in the past 2 years, we've seen that environment deteriorate. Back in 2020, of course, and then in 2021 again. And it's sort of plateauing almost, but also there's a bit of that reversal in trend. And this is important to note because there's a multitude of factors that's leading to this globally. This is something that we need to kind of come together in order to overcome. And these include, of course, the pandemic. The repercussions of the pandemic are not just limited to 2020 or 2021. We're going to see the repercussions of this play out into the food security sort of universe for years to come. We also know that conflict remains one of the primary drivers of food insecurity globally, and that has only exacerbated food insecurity this year. And then, of course, one of the very long-term, but also something that's been plaguing our food system for a while, is climate variability. And so these factors combined, climate, conflict, and of course the pandemic, have really exacerbated the food insecurity situation globally. This score of overall score of 60.9, when we kind of open this up, and this is the average of 113 countries, but when we look at it more from a country by country perspective, we see a very large diversity or divergence in country scores. So Ireland actually tops the index with a score of 84, and is supported and joined by quite a few European countries. 7 of the top 10 spots in the index are held by European countries currently, and Ireland, of course, tops that. Now, on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom of the index, the lowest ranking countries, we see Sub-Saharan Africa continuing to dominate this with the seven out of the 10 spots taken by Sub-Saharan African countries. And in 2021, our bottom scoring country was Burundi with a score of 34.67. Now, what's important is that that's less than half of what Ireland scored. So we see a very large disparity in how countries are performing. I want to talk a little bit quickly about the US findings in the Global Food Security Index. As you can see here, this is the overall score of the US for the past 10 years. It's sort of improved over the years, but then sort of also sort of plateaued out. It's hovered between the 77 and 80 points range. It's sort of, I would say it's kind of remained unchanged, if you will, starting at 77.8, and in the latest index in 2021 achieved about 79.1 in the overall environment. However, what we can say is that downward pressure on these scores remains. So while there is some volatility, the risks remain to the downside in the US. We'll talk a little bit about specifically about what's driving this by breaking this down into the indicators or the pillars, the category pillars. And here what you can see is the sort of I guess 2017 score compared with the 2021 score. And here you'll see the performance has been quite mixed. So while availability has increased marginally and quality and safety also sort of hovered around the same, where we see a lot of the pressure in the US on food security drivers are around affordability and natural resources and resilience. We see a drop in affordability that's quite significant, as well as the downward pressure between 2017 and 2021 on natural resource and resilience as well. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this, and then we'll talk about this in much more detail during our panel as well. But when we're exploring some of those drivers of food security in the US, we've broken this down by not just the pillars, but also the sub-indicators within these pillars. And this shows you the year-on-year change in the US score. So as we know that score has dropped in 2021, for the overall environment, as well as some of the major drivers of this, which include affordability and even availability in 2021. Of course, food prices are a big driver of that drop, as well as increases in inequality and change in tariffs. We're also seeing under the availability category, this measures not just production, but also access to production. So it includes things like political and social barriers, food loss, as well as food security commitments to policy and agency. And in this category, we see some of the drops in volatility of production and also investments in ag R&D. Quality and safety remains one of the better performing indicators for the US, with relatively good progress across compared to the rest of the 112 countries, of course. And natural resources and resilience, there's still a lot of areas for the US to improve, particularly when it comes to water, land management, as well as political commitments to adaptation. I'll leave it there, and I know we will come back to discuss more. So I'll hand it back to Dominic for now.
Hi, everyone. Um, so next we will have Priya Fielding Singh join us. And Priya is now at the University of Utah, is that right? And has been an author, wrote the book How the Other Half Eats, um, which is telling the story of food and inequality in America. So I welcome you to the virtual stage next.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for the introduction. Thank you, Catherine, for the really vital work that you're doing in Buffalo in the midst of just unimaginable tragedy. And thank you, Pratima, for that illuminative talk about the drivers of food security globally and domestically. I'm grateful to the New York Federal Reserve Bank for the opportunity to share a little bit of my research with you all today. So as a sociologist of food and health equity, a really central focus of my work is on examining how broader systemic inequities drive disparities in our diets and diet-related disease. And I do that through ethnographic methods, so through spending time on the ground with families and communities as they make difficult choices around food and diet. And really foundational to the work that I do is the perspective that I bring to that work as a sociologist. And that perspective is informed by the understanding that while so many of us study and research and advocate around issues of food because we're deeply invested in promoting good nutrition and promoting nutrition equity across society, every single one of us also knows as human beings that food is about so much more than nutrition. That is, we don't just eat to physically nourish ourselves, but all of us also eat to fulfill really key social, cultural, and emotional functions in our lives. We eat to connect with others. We eat to show love and care, to transmit culture, to remember who we are and where we came from and what we believe in. And so in my research, I use sociological methods and theory to try to understand these complex meanings that food holds to people and to try to account for them in ways that let me identify new mechanisms that drive nutritional inequality in the United States. And by nutritional inequality, what I'm referring to specifically is the glaring disparity in the nutritional or diet quality of what families eat in this country. And these are disparities that affect both adults and children alike. And they're disparities that routinely and systematically privilege higher income, more highly educated white Americans. These disparities matter tremendously because they fundamentally help drive broader health disparities across society. So we know that a low quality diet is consistently linked to multiple chronic diseases. And in fact, in the United States, a low quality diet is the leading contributor to mortality. It causes 500,000 deaths per year. So this is all to say on the most basic level, and without trying to sound too dramatic, that what we eat is actually literally a matter of life and death. And so the seriousness of this matter means that there's really an urgency in answering this question of what drives nutritional inequality. So what is it that accounts for the dietary gap between the most and the least privileged in American society? So about a decade ago, or maybe 15 years ago, a number of academics, policymakers, and food advocates alike began to coalesce around a central answer to this question. And they proposed that differences in access to healthy food drove differences in diet quality. And scholars, and we'll hear about a lot of these kinds of access today, but they focused on two kinds of access in particular. So the first was geographic access. So what many of us associate with the term food desert, or as Catherine mentioned now, food apartheid, that describes spatial disparities in families' access to healthy food, with traditionally lower income and families of color more likely to live in neighborhoods without supermarkets or access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And the second kind of access that's been focused on a lot is financial or affordability, with the basic argument here being that in the United States over the past 30 years, on a calorie basis, healthy food has become much more expensive than unhealthy food, thereby incentivizing families with fewer funds to make less healthy dietary choices. Now, the popularity of the food access arguments was in many ways spurred by the Let's Move campaign to reduce childhood obesity that began in 2010 and that helped popularize the idea that childhood obesity in particular stemmed in part from inadequate geographic food access. And the argument itself had really wide appeal because it offers a straightforward, actionable solution. If access is the problem, then the fix is really clear. By opening supermarkets in low-income communities, families' nutrition will improve and obesity rates will fall. And so over the next decade, eliminating food deserts became a really central element of the campaign. And really Herculean policy efforts have followed at the federal, state, and local levels to increase low-income communities' access to healthy food. But as effective as those efforts may be at reducing food insecurity, an extremely worthwhile and important goal, if the goal of those efforts was to improve families' diet quality and reduce obesity, then these initiatives' impacts proved surprisingly disappointing, as researchers showed that increasing geographic food access does not alone improve families' diets. In fact, a 2019 econometric analysis suggested that differences in food access account for just 10% of the nutritional gap in the United States, which means that 90% of dietary differences are not due to food access. Now, the authors of the study I just mentioned argue that this 90% is due to differences in consumer demand, and prior research points us toward many key factors that may yield such demand-side differences, from disparities in health and nutrition literacy to inequalities in time available to buy and prepare healthy foods, as well as really significant differences in exposure to marketing from the food and beverage industry. But in my work, I find that beyond and in relation to all of these demand-side factors, something even more fundamentally structural is also helping to drive these disparities. And it's something that can be hard to pick up on or understand unless you spend a lot of time on the ground with families trying to understand the complexity and nuances of how they make difficult dietary choices and financial trade-offs. But that is what I did, and that's the work that I do as a sociologist. So for years, I studied nutritional inequality in a place known for inequality, the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a place where the top 1% of income earners make 44 times more than everyone else. And it's a place where I chose to conduct interviews with hundreds of parents and children across socioeconomic status and race ethnicity, as well as spend months alongside 4 families that I feature in my book to understand how families from all walks of life do the hard work of putting food on the table. And one of the things that I learned from this research was this: even if we fix geographic and financial access to healthy food, which we absolutely need to do, we are still going to see a nutritional gap in this country unless we tackle the root causes of, of those differences in access. And I say this because a really key finding from my work is that the sheer experience of living in poverty, of living without knowing if you can pay next month's rent or keep the heat on in the winter, doesn't just make it hard to afford or access healthy food. It can also shape the very meaning of food itself. So let me illustrate with a really small example. So through my interviews with mothers, I learned that most moms care deeply about their kids' diets and health. They wanted their kids to eat a nutritious diet, and they explicitly connected the dots between a healthy diet and a healthy body. But I found that moms were really differently poised to be able to realize that core value that they all held. So I remember one afternoon, I was spending time with a lower income mom, Naya, a mom who was really living hand to mouth, who was raising her 2 daughters in a context of extreme economic scarcity and unrelenting food insecurity. And for Naya, making the rent each month, paying the utilities, putting the gas in the car, all of these things hinged critically on saying no to her kids' requests for things. Naya and other lower income moms I met had to say no to their kids all the time. They had to say no to vacation and summer camp, to a new pair of jeans or a replacement for a shattered phone screen. And as I watch Naya and other moms say no again and again and again to their kids' requests, I realized something so simple, that in a world of no, food was actually something that Naya could almost always say yes to. Naya could almost always find the buck at the bottom of her purse to buy her kids a can of Coke or a bag of Cheetos. There was almost always a sofa cushion that could be overturned to reveal a few coins that could help buy a candy bar that her kids were begging her for. And so when Naya could say yes to her kids, she did say yes. And when she said yes, she used that less healthy food to buffer her kids against scarcity, to demonstrate her love and care for them, and to show herself and others that she was a good and responsive mom, a competent caregiver who was not just able to meet her kids' basic physical needs, but their emotional ones as well. One lower income mom I interviewed summed up the symbolic potency of food within this context of economic scarcity when she told me about her daughters. The way I feel about food is like, if they need food and they're hungry, then I'm gonna buy it. I don't care how much money's in my pocket. I'll spend my last $20. One day they'll know I love them and that's all that matters. If she wants a $2 candy bar, I get it for her if I have it. So I'll wrap up by suggesting that what Naya's and other lower income moms' experiences show us is that access to healthy food is not just about geography and finances, although it is about those things too, but it's also about living a life with enough financial stability and security that a nutritious diet becomes practical and desirable. Access to healthy food is about having the cognitive and emotional bandwidth to be able to prioritize healthy eating. It's about going to sleep every night knowing that the next day there will be money for you and your kids so that you're able to prioritize your kids' nutrition and not just their satiation. And so to ensure that every family in this country has that kind of access, we need to be at the heart of it, simultaneously advancing solutions that effectively and enduringly lift families out of poverty. If we can do that, if we can create a context for moms wherein giving their kids a bag of Cheetos is just a fun treat, then we can make it so that that bag of Cheetos isn't this potent symbol of love and care amidst a backdrop of scarcity. So I'll conclude my remarks there, and I look forward to hearing the panel next and to moderating the domestic panel later.
Thank you so much, Priya, for sharing these powerful stories and really letting us look into your journey through your work and through your research. It's really moving to hear and really in a way substantiates in a human way what has helped lay out as well. And I think between the two, we have a really good framing context for both of our discussions. And so I think the next piece of this is our Global Perspectives panel, which I will invite Pratama back to the stage to moderate. So welcome back.
Thanks, Dominic, and thanks, Priya, for really eloquently highlighting some of those stories and really bringing this to life and putting a face to some of the things that we've been talking about. So really appreciate it. And I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the global perspectives and what we can learn from other countries at this point. And to do that, I'd like to invite our two panelists, very esteemed panel with Rob Voss, who is Director for Markets, Trade and Institutions at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Welcome to Rob, and also to Tom Arnold, who is the Special Envoy for Food Systems at the Government of Ireland, and he is chair of the high-level expert group on at the European Commission. So welcome to you too, Tom, just to be able to take the time and share your insights and learnings and thoughts with us. As Priya highlighted, food is obviously a very important cultural, social, has a lot of that context as well. But of course, she also mentioned access, and through our index, we also look at availability and access and how social barriers can restrict food security. I want to kind of think through a little bit broadly, though, some of the factors that we mentioned around financial access and, of course, geographical as well, but particularly financial today. Affordability is one of the US's, I guess, largest drops in terms of performance, but also globally, we're seeing today that affordability remains very much top of mind for policymakers. We've seen in February, the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is the UN Organization for Food, the food price index hit its all-time high, record highs since records began, basically in the 1990s. So we know that food prices are really soaring at this point. There's been a massive shock, I guess, to economic systems. All of this is definitely top down, but it feeds into how families are actually able to achieve food security going forward. So let me start by posing a very broad question to both of you. So feel free to raise your hand and start the conversation. But as we're looking at affordability, which is the financial driver here, with food prices, what's going on? What's driving these all-time record highs for food prices this year?
If I may start, thanks, Pratima, and welcome to everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's good to put things in perspective. I like the way what Priya mentioned as sort of a challenge increasingly for people in the United States. But this is a struggle that more than 1/3 of the world population is facing every day. So more than 3 billion people cannot afford what we call a nutrition adequate diet, which on average for the world comes down about $3.50 per person per day. So it's not a lot of money, but for more than 3 billion people cannot afford that diet. And if we think also of the concerns we have now with rising food prices, we're talking particularly now about prices of food that people have come accustomed to be very cheap. Our wheat, our maize, our rice for long have been relatively cheap. And when we talk about the affordability of nutrition adequate diets, the higher cost component are the fruits and vegetables and the animal sourced food. So what we're seeing now is a rise of those prices. Of course, that's also a problem to many people around the world. There's a bit less than 1 billion people that cannot even afford a diet that is just enough in terms of calorie intake, right? So that's basically provided by your wheat, your maize, and your vegetable oils, as well as by rice. And that's the type of prices that we're talking about at the moment. So it's very good to realize that this is not something that's happening today. It's a shock to one part of the food price system, but it's reverberating around the world. Now, onto your question on what's driving these prices. Again, it's good to realize that the recent surge is part of a trend that's already started over a year ago, particularly with the recovery from the COVID recession. Actually, food prices went down, and then nobody complains, and prices go down. Of course, but with the increased demand for food with the recovery, also prices went up, and that was compounded by weather shocks. We had droughts in South America, also harvests suffered in the U.S. and parts of Europe, as well as that other prices went up, input costs went up, oil prices, fertilizer prices have gone up, and that's been driving up particularly prices of the basic grains as well as vegetable oils in the market. So that's what we're seeing now, and that's been compounded by the war in Ukraine, because Russia and Ukraine are part of what we call the breadbasket of some parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and other countries, but it reverberates around the world. With those countries, they command about 30% of the trade in the basic grains, and even more of that, more than 70% of some of the vegetable oils like sunflower oil. So that's why this has a compounding effect, but it's good for people to realize that it's not just something of this moment. There are structural factors underlying this, and that we have more than 3 billion people that cannot afford a nutritious diet every day, even before the situation of the recent rises in food prices.
Thanks for that, Rob. You're absolutely right. This is not new. We've seen food prices increase, fertilizer prices as well, of course, with the Russian shock as a big exporter of fertilizers. That was exacerbated. But maybe, Tom, I'll come to you to share a little bit about the European perspective and Ireland in particular. We can see Ireland top the index, but also generally Europe does really well. What are some of the things that we can learn, but also how do we actually manage some of these shocks that Rob was mentioning? It's not just 2022. We've seen shocks before. We're going to continue to see shocks going forward. How can we actually mitigate that impact or at least manage it a little bit more effectively?
Well, thank you, Pratima. And before I directly answer your question, just to say it's a real pleasure to be on this panel and particularly to be responding to the Economist index, because by coincidence, the very first year it started, I was also on a panel for the Economist at a meeting in South Africa to launch this report. So it's very interesting to see the insights that your work over the last 10 years has thrown up. I think Rob has very accurately described what has been happening over recent times. And it is important to say that the current acute crisis, which has been highlighted by Ukraine, hasn't come out of the blue. I mean, it's been building for the last period of time, and COVID came along, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, what are the insights that we can draw from this? That's your essential question. Well, I think it is that we actually do have to take this issue of food security, I would say more precisely food and nutrition security, a lot more seriously. Because if we don't take it seriously, we are heading towards some really serious political problems. Now, the last time the world faced something like this was 2007, 2008. And there was at that stage a response in that at a high political level, people responded. And they responded by saying, we have to tackle the short-term problem of dealing with the increase in the number of hungry people. But that response has to be put into a longer-term time frame to deal with the underlying problems. We have a similar broad approach that is happening at the moment. Delivering it, of course, is a separate matter, but at least in terms of framing a policy and a political approach, that's what's happening. And we've seen, for example, a couple of major initiatives at the UN level. Something called the UN Global Crisis Response Group has been set up. The World Bank is putting in place a response as well. An important paper from the 12th of April which spelled out that they wanted to engage at both a short-term response, and short-term meaning the next 15 months, and then a longer term as well, that should happen. And then even more recently, you had a meeting just 1 week ago in New York at the UN talking about setting out a roadmap for global food security, call for action. And many of the elements of that are going to be agreed at a G7 meeting at the end of June. So we have the beginnings in place of, I think, a coherent response to the current crisis. That has to be, the money has to be found for it, and then the actual implementation of it has to be found as well. So I think we're setting off on the right on the right track, but fundamentally we have to realize that the food and nutrition crisis that we are facing in the middle of 2022 has to be met by a seriousness of political response that hasn't been seen for many years. And if we're talking about who does what, well, I think the US has a really important role to play, but all the other major players also have an important role to play. And then if I can just conclude, because I know we're all very scarce with time, I was very struck by Priya's insights into what impact at the most basic level of the household income and household welfare how that translates into poor levels of nutrition. And I think they are the key insights. And I think the planning that the United States is heading towards having a White House meeting in September on food, nutrition, and health is of very great importance. I think it's of very great importance to the United States, but it's actually also of great importance to the rest of the world, because the US has, I think, probably among the most severe problems, but everyone else has problems of a broadly similar nature, even if they're not as bad. So the US, I think, has a real role here to help itself and the world out of this basic issue of food, nutrition, and health.
Thanks very much, Tom. I think really fascinating insights in terms of how everybody needs to come together, and then also how a lot of this is done at the macro level, but how this is really affecting the household. And nutritional security at a household level is really what we're trying to achieve through all of these research studies as well, because it really needs to translate into action on the ground. But to your point around, there needs to be political commitment and political will to discuss some of these issues in a comprehensive way. And then, of course, the execution of these commitments also has to happen. At that point, I know we have time for one more question, and I think this is something that's top of mind for everybody. Something that again needs an all stakeholders response. I think that is basically one of the most critical things that are affecting risks that are affecting the food system, and that's climate risk. We spoke about production and variability in global production. And we are basically working with a food system that has to feed more people. We have to cut food loss, absolutely, but we need to feed more people in a sustainable way. And we're not taking very good care of our resources to be able to do that. So I guess the last question that I want to pose, because this, of course, is a big risk that will affect the US, will affect all the 3 billion people that face some form of food insecurity every day. How can we better, and this is a large question, so I'll ask you to maybe share 2 points, 2 high-level points from your perspective. How can we better manage, or how can we incentivize more sustainable agriculture through a policy level that we can implement quickly, or any examples that we've seen that work that we can actually share with the audience today on managing sustainable, or just having a more sustainable agricultural and food system going forward? So quickly, maybe Rob, I'll ask you to share 2 points, and then Tom, if we could turn to you as well.
Well, thanks, Fatima. Well, these are big questions, but let me just highlight a few points to indicate the directions we should take, and maybe start the direction we should not take. So first, in the present crisis, we see a number of responses that do more harm than do good. And one of them, what we've been seeing, is that we see panic buying from some countries that try to restock their reserves of food, of basic grains. And so more importantly, we see countries imposing trade restrictions. Typically, that does more harm. That's one of the lessons we learned from the previous global food price crisis, 2007, 2008, 10, 11, when major producing countries imposed export restrictions for good reasons, trying to protect and keep prices low for their own consumers, but making things worse for everybody else, right? And so this kind of selfish behavior by countries should be avoided. If we see now that about 16% of the global trading calories are now subject to one form of export restriction or another, including the sanctions. So this is huge, right? Because it's just what happens is just further driving up prices in markets. So that's one of the things we shouldn't do. It also tries to short-term responses in the US and also in Europe. There have been voices to expand agricultural lands to increase production, something we should not do, particularly because it's in these cases, it's to expand production on lands that are now under some form of environmental protection. So once you've put that under cultivation, then to put it back is not going to be good for sustainable development and for the impacts of climate change. And also, it's not a good response to the present crisis. So it's not like we lack production per se, right? The markets may be tight, but it's all these other factors that add to the push up of prices. So that's just one comment. And there could be more of these things. But in terms of the longer term perspective, things we should be doing, first coming back to the affordability of diets, we need a lot more investment in technology improvement, research and development, like we've seen for improved varieties of wheat, of maize, and so on over the past decades. Has tremendously increased food productivity, but we've done much less on the same score for fruits, vegetables, and other production of more nutrient-dense food. So that's one area where we should pay a lot more attention to, and also do that in ways that are both make those productions more climate resilient. So we have many forms and technologies available that can improve the climate resilience, so make them drought resilient, heat resilient, and so on, particularly for crops. We have ready to go technologies, simply feeding cows with seaweed or other products like that, improving the feed of animals, can reduce methane emissions from livestock production by at least half if that would be done around the world. So you have all these technologies, but we have to make sure that will be adopted around the world, and do so in ways that increase productivity. Right. So we've run basically out of land to produce more food. We have to do things much more efficiently, but also to address the problem of affordability and access to food. We need increasing productivity, particularly in low-income countries. Most countries depend on agriculture and food systems directly for their income. So to do things more productively will also provide them with greater income opportunities to do things better. So in the longer run, so we could do a whole lot, and where policies could start, and that's where I'd like to think through the enormous subsidies that countries and governments presently give to agricultural systems around the world that are not all conducive of the outcomes that we want. And that's about almost $700 billion per year that government spends on support to agricultural systems. So not saying that there's no need to support agricultural systems, but if we do that more smartly in the directions I just mentioned, to invest more in productivity, enhancing and more sustainable production methods on one hand, and reward the farmers and other food producers that who adopt those practices and provide eco services to food systems. That way, we can do that and come to much more better climate outcomes, better outcomes for affordability of food, for reducing food insecurity around the world, and hopefully also to improve diets for everybody around the world. So the way I would like to conclude is that these kinds of problems, the challenge of climate change is the biggest threat to food systems, but also to address the other concerns with food insecurity, hunger, as well as poor diets around the world. I think those are problems that need to be solved together. If not, we won't solve any of the problems.
That's a great point. We can't look at these issues in isolation anymore. Tom, maybe I'll turn it over to you quickly to share.
Yeah, well, I'll be very brief, but I'll pick up from that last point that Rob made, because we have had in the last year a really important event, the UN Food System Summit. And this was really a full acknowledgement that we have to start thinking in food systems terms, in fact, in sustainable food system terms. And that means that you recognize the interconnection between policies for food, policies for climate, and policies for health. And up to now, in the last decade, that insight into the interconnectedness of policies has not been recognized, and certainly hasn't been expressed in strategies and policies. So that accepting that and moving forward on that basis is of critical importance. You say that you note in your own index that Ireland came out on top of the food security index. Part of the reason I think we've done that is, apart from sort of sensible economic management, is that there's been a consistency of policy in the agri-food sector over the last 20 years. And its most recent expression is our vision for the next decade, which I chaired, and it's called Foods Vision 2030. And at the heart of that is a commitment to sustainable food systems. Now, the second but linked point is that we haven't put enough emphasis internationally of the link between food and climate. And that was very much exemplified by the fact that the COP process, which has been going on now for nearly 30 years. It's only in relatively recent times that they began to acknowledge that there's an important food dimension to this issue. Because obviously food production in its wide sense accounts for a high level of global emissions, and the sector itself has to work towards reducing those. So, for example, at the next COP meeting in Cairo in November, I would think a really full acknowledgement of this connection has to be made, and practical decisions made as to how we can move forward to have a much more environmentally efficient agri-food sector for the world.
That's a
Thank
great
you.
point. Thank you very much, Tom, and to Rob, to both of you. It was just really interesting to hear, and I think just to respond quickly to your point, Tom, around the acknowledgement of how food and climate are inextricably linked, and then also obviously adding in the health element, because we obviously talk about nutrition and health very, very closely. That's only been very recent, and yes, we talk about how agriculture contributes to climate change, and it is an important contributing factor, very, very much so. But also, agriculture and the food system as a whole can also help in mitigating and adapt to some of those risks that we're going to face. I mean, Rob, you brought up the point about feeding cows seaweed and reducing methane emissions. I mean, this is the way we can kind of progress forward, looking at technology, investing in R&D in order to not just mitigate some of the negative implications, but also let's think about how we can plant more trees, intercropping, all of these other factors that can help with us managing or in encouraging our food system to be much more sustainable and actually feed the planet. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, both Rob and Tom, for sharing your insights. Really important to understand this global perspective, what we can learn, how we've managed this in the past, to then also apply to the US and think about how the US can improve its food security situation. So with that, I will hand it over to Priya to chair our next session on domestic responses. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Pratima, Rob, and Tom, for that really illuminative conversation and for painting a picture of food security, of course, on the global level, but also really thoughtfully connecting those dots between differences, similarities, and synergies between the US and the rest of the world when it comes to this issue. So in the United States, I think we're at an extremely important and really opportune moment to be having a conversation about food and nutrition insecurity. And just to kind of paint the picture of what things look like in the United States really briefly, what we know is that more than 38 million people, and that includes 12 million children in the United States, experience food insecurity. And as startling as these numbers are, I think the disparities in these rates that we've seen in many ways grow during the pandemic are even more startling, and they speak to broader social inequities that impact families' abilities to get the food that they need. So what we know is that in the United States, compared to white households, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous households are more likely to experience food insecurity, as well as households with children, and especially families that are headed by a single mother. And so just given that we know how devastating the short and long-term impacts of food security can be on people's educational and economic and health outcomes. It just speaks to the criticality of having this conversation about what we can do and what we can learn from abroad about how to tackle food security. And of course, within the United States specifically, this is all set within a context of inflation at a 40-year high, food prices surging, and now a dire infant formula shortage. But I think what the pandemic in the last couple of years have also shown us is that as difficult as the situation is, there are policies and programs to effectively address food insecurity. It has shown us that we do have the resources and the defenses to fight hunger if only we can muster the political will to do so. So to discuss all of these issues and more, I'm really honored to be joined by three panelists who are experts and boots on the ground leaders on these issues. So first, Tara Colton is Executive Vice President for Economic Security at the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. And Tara brings to this conversation nearly 20 years of leadership experience in the public and nonprofit sectors, focusing on developing and implementing innovative programs and services for workers, families, students, and businesses. In her current role, she leads initiatives that align with Governor Murphy's commitment to a stronger, fairer New Jersey. That includes leading programs to alleviate food insecurity, eliminate food deserts, strengthen the childcare sector, and address racial disparities in maternal health care. Second, we have Frankie Martinez Blanco, who is a political strategist with over 15 years of experience in presidential and New York City politics. He currently serves as Director of Federal Affairs for the Mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And in his prior roles, he served in the Obama White House, U.S. Department of Education, and Emerson Collective, as well as a member of the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico's status during the Obama administration. And then finally, we have Vince Hall, who is the Chief Government Relations Officer for Feeding America, the nation's largest domestic hunger relief organization. So in his role, Vince leads the development and execution of feeding legislative and advocacy strategies to empower communities and improve food security. And he brings to this role extensive nonprofit and public sector management experience, including serving as the CEO of Feeding San Diego and Chief of Staff for the San Diego Office of the Mayor. So I'd love to kick off the conversation with you, Vince. So what we've seen over the past few years is really this transition from an acute pandemic-induced crisis of food insecurity to a more sustained hunger crisis. Can you give us a sense of the forces that have led to that, as well as what Feeding America has been doing to tackle these issues?
Thank you so much, Priya, and thank you for your extraordinarily important research that informs the work of Feeding America every day. Thank you to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as well for including me on this panel. Just as a level set, Feeding America is a national network of 200 member food banks that cover all of the United States and Puerto Rico. Those 200 food banks are networked to over 60,000 faith-based and charitable organizations that receive food from our warehouses and distribute it to the community in a variety of ways that address the unique demographics and requirements of each person facing food insecurity. Since the start of the pandemic, Feeding America food banks have distributed over 11 billion meals to people in need, and it is the largest hunger relief network in the United States. It's interesting the way you frame the question, because I think you're absolutely right, Priya, that we are transitioning from a pandemic crisis to a hunger crisis. In our most recent survey of our food banks, it was clear that the vast majority of our food banks, over 90%, are seeing sustained or increased levels of demand at food distributions. So the reopening of the economy, the return of the U.S. workforce to near full employment levels has not been accompanied by a reduction in demand at food banks. There are a number of factors for that. And I would like to point out, though, that during the pandemic itself, food insecurity could have been much, much worse, but for the very substantial federal interventions through federal nutrition programs, coupled with unprecedented philanthropy towards the charitable food system. And the combination of increased service and resources from both of those systems mitigated what could have been a hunger disaster. One of the sad undertones of that work during the pandemic, though, was, as you pointed out, racial disparities exist and were actually accelerated and amplified during the pandemic. So that while the combination of charitable and government interventions reduced food insecurity for white populations in the United States, it actually increased disparities, affecting negatively the African American and Latino populations. And so we have so much work to do to not just map out a roadmap to end hunger, but to address in a very serious and immediate way the racially disparate outcomes of our work that are disadvantaging some of the most vulnerable communities. But the factors combining at this moment to create this sustained and amplified hunger crisis include the fact that federal nutrition programs are going back to pre-COVID levels. We're losing critical additional funding for federal commodity programs, for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, waivers that make it easier to distribute school meals and after-school meals, other youth meal programs like summer meal programs. We're losing flexibilities that make it easier to enroll people in the SNAP program or to enroll people in other federal nutrition benefits. So the idea that COVID is over means that many in Congress are seeking to return us to pre-COVID rules and funding levels. And that is unsustainable given the fact that we are still seeing such high and increasing demand for food at food distributions. Food banks are also every bit as affected by supply chain disruptions as the private sector. And we have been relying more than ever on purchased food because supply chain disruptions have reduced by 20% the amount of donated food that comes to Feeding America food banks. We have also seen the really devastating effect of inflation on all aspects of our work. On the demand side, inflation means that consumers who were right on the margin have less purchasing power at the grocery store and are turning to food banks to close their monthly food budget. And for those that are already dependent on the SNAP program, it receives an annual inflationary adjustment. The benefit level is already insufficient for most families. And America's food banks, and I say this as a former food banker myself, we see people in the last 10 to 14 days of the month who should be able to rely on SNAP benefits for their monthly food budget, but instead the EBT card has a zero balance. And so for 10 or 14 days at the bottom of the month, they're turning to food distributions. And then at the first of the month, their EBT card gets recharged. Inflation is only amplifying that impact. So on the supply side, because we are now so heavily leveraged on purchased food, we are very vulnerable to the 40% increase in food that we're seeing compared to last year for some commodities. But overall, everything that we're purchasing is more expensive. Even, by the way, on donated food, usually it's on Feeding America food banks to transport donated food from the donor to the warehouse and often from the warehouse to the community. So the costs of fuel are exceptionally important. And many panelists today have spoken to the need for nutritional content, and Feeding America food banks are distributing more fresh fruits and vegetables than ever before. But guess what? The cost of the cold storage, the cost of the capital equipment, refrigeration, coolers, everything associated with providing healthier foods is getting more expensive by the day. So inflation is really having a very serious negative impact on all of our work. And I agree with Tom's comment that we have an opportunity with the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health to focus the entirety of our government and hopefully a significant portion of our population on the issue of hunger and map out strategies. But it is going to be a conference that has to look both at the long-term 2030 vision, but also the short-term crisis that we are now finding ourselves leading into as we lead out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Vince. There are so many things that you discussed that are just extremely important to understanding how this crisis works. But one thing that you mentioned that I just wanted to highlight for the audience is that we know that the majority of people who use SNAP run out of their benefits by the third week. That is, the amount of money that SNAP allocates is just completely insufficient to actually feed a family. And at the same time, I agree with you that what we saw with federal relief packages was that certain policies can be extremely effective at tackling hunger. So we know with the child tax credit that one of the top 2 to 3 things that families spent that money on was food, right? On basic needs. And so, we know what some of these tools are that work, but our decision to decide that the pandemic is over and that we no longer need those tools has really, I think, to your point, kind of put us into this more sustained crisis that we could actually effectively tackle if we wanted to implement those policies on an ongoing basis. So Tara, you work for an economic development agency. Can you tell us a bit, this conversation is about the intersection of food security and economic resilience. Can you tell us a bit about why your agency has taken on tackling food insecurity and what that response has looked like on the ground?
Sure, thank you, and really an honor to be here. Um, I'm proud to be representing the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, which is not a traditional seat at this table. And the fact that we're here is by design and also by, in some ways, a reimagination of what economic development means. And that is really driven from the leadership of our governor, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, who has said from the outset of his administration that he's committed to a stronger, fairer New Jersey. And I think that the types of strategies that we have embarked upon as our administration, but then certainly the work that we do at the New Jersey EDA are embodiments of that, that focus on place-based, people-driven strategies, and also recognizing the complexity of circumstances, many of which predated COVID, but as many of the speakers have already alluded to, have been sort of exacerbated or in some cases amplified during COVID. And I think one of the um, troubling but powerful silver linings is it has exposed the scale of hunger that's been hiding in plain sight. Certainly, as our food bank colleagues have shared, just the depth and breadth of New Jerseyans, Americans, people around the world who grapple with food insecurity. So we're really proud to be rolling out a series of comprehensive initiatives to combat food deserts and alleviate food insecurity. But we're doing it partly because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the smart thing to do. And that's why I think it's particularly powerful that an economic development agency is taking this on. It isn't we work very closely with our partners in social services and health, et cetera, but that we're taking this on as an economic agenda. And so that takes several forms. Last year, Governor Murphy signed the New Jersey Economic Recovery Act, which was a suite of packages of legislation, about 15 different programs that were approved through that. One of them is called the Food Desert Relief Act, and that authorizes the New Jersey EDA, our agency, to deploy close to $1 billion in resources, approximately $240 million over 6 years, on a host of strategies to combat food deserts. Chief among that effort was to recognize that, and I know the term food desert there are different perspectives in that term and different opinions of it, but importantly, we recognize that it's a complex ecosystem that New Jerseyans are living in, and that we wanted to be really thoughtful about what it even means to constitute a food desert. And so the first step that we took over the past several months was to do a comprehensive designation process for the 50 essentially highest ranking food desert communities throughout New Jersey. And those are importantly not defined solely by, do you have a supermarket? Great, you're not a food desert. Oh, you need a supermarket, you must be a food desert. We consider demographic factors, things like access to vehicles, affordability. So you may have a food retailer, but what kind of, are they accepting SNAP? We looked at factors like the actual transportation that was needed, public transit. We also looked at food swamps. And this was a really exhaustive process that we did after a pretty significant public feedback agenda. And so we were very proud. We think we've put together the most comprehensive designation of and definition of food deserts in the country. And that's all available on our website at njeda.com. There's detailed methodology, and there's a map that you can go through to determine where, look closely and see where the boundaries are. And so what we are very pleased about is that now that that has been approved and those designations are in place, we have a toolkit of resources that we can use to deploy the people that live within those food deserts. But all told, there's about 1.5 million New Jerseyans who reside within one of these 50 food desert communities. And our toolkit consists of a number of programs that we're developing. The one is the provision of tax credits to support supermarket and grocery store development within these food desert communities. That's the most traditional, suppose, intervention, but the law also gives us the ability to sell those tax credits and use the proceeds for cash for grants and loans and technical assistance. And that portfolio of programs is going to be much broader in terms of the kinds of interventions that we can support, whether it's technology. There's an explicit focus in the law around the shift of SNAP to e-commerce. There's the ability to purchase equipment or transport materials, but also we want to have the ability to be innovative when it comes to new strategies to combat food insecurity. And so a month or two ago, we also announced a new program where we are inviting communities throughout New Jersey to submit plans to designate distressed assets within their communities that could be repurposed for use as to provide food, transport, process, et cetera. So we're really excited about that. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and then I'll wrap up, is a program that we launched over a year ago that has frankly grown beyond our wildest imagination. And it's something that the governor always says is a win-win-win. It's called Sustain and Serve New Jersey. And it was a model that we launched where the New Jersey EDA gives grants to nonprofits, and then they use those grants to purchase meals from small businesses, from restaurants, and then the meals are distributed for free to New Jerseyans in need. And so we launched that program as a $2 million pilot. It is now a $45 million program. We have supported the purchase already of 3.5 million meals from more than 400 restaurants throughout the state. So it keeps the restaurants open, it keeps them working, it helps provide the meals to people who need them. And importantly, and I think this goes back to some of the opening comments, it confers a level of dignity to the recipients of the meals, that they're getting fresh, hot, nutritious, homemade meals, and something that, as we've talked about, the food represents so much more than just the meal. So I'll stop there, happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara, and I really appreciate you bringing in the importance of dignity in all of this, which I feel like can sometimes get left out of the conversation. And I also really admire the work that you're doing and the the precision in thinking about what is it that constitutes a food desert or a food swamp, and thinking about the resources and assets and strategies that families use to keep themselves food secure, to find food when they need it. And I think that just thinking about what constitutes food access in a really nuanced way is so important for us to design effective and targeted interventions that are actually going to substantially improve families' access to healthy food. So I really appreciate you sharing a bit about the approach and the work that you do. So Frankie, you are deeply familiar with responding to food crises in the event of national emergencies. So one of the most recent and tragic examples of this in Puerto Rico was the arrival of Hurricane Maria in 2017, which impacted 100% of the island, crippled infrastructure and food supply. So can you tell us a bit about how policymakers and the public and private sectors responded to that? And importantly, like what lessons we can glean from that mobilization as far as how we can best address issues of food security in times of crisis?
Yes, thank you for having me today, and thanks for that time for this important research. Like you said, I wanted to talk about responding to food insecurity during national crisis, and here working for the city of San Juan. That was an issue we had to grapple with, and we were not ready for in 2017, given that historically hurricanes only affected a percentage of the island. So when we were prepared for hurricanes, we had food centers in different areas. So there was always somewhere else we could respond. This hurricane was historic, given that it affected 100% of the island, and we were not ready to handle it. The infrastructure was crippled. Even our food storage locations were not even the regular residents of the whole island weren't able to access them. So what we really saw was that we hadn't built or prepared those pipelines, especially with nonprofits. The nonprofit sector in Puerto Rico it's not as strong. It's got a very strong after Maria. That's been one positive aspect of the hurricane, but it wasn't as strong as it should have been, especially those pipelines with other organizations, other communities, institutions outside of the island that could respond quickly and be able to navigate the logistical difficulties of bringing that food to Puerto Rico. Because again, if it hadn't happened before, people just didn't know the obstacles, didn't know how to prepare. So luckily, we've prepared a lot. We've done a lot of, it's been a lot of liaising a lot with federal agencies, and this is where kind of my job comes in. And we're really focusing on preparing for the worst. But I'm very excited about all that since 2017, all the work we've done with, especially with nonprofits in New York City, in Florida, in other southern states that have also have been affected by hurricanes before, so they also know what are the specific challenges that are needed, especially to tackle food insecurity. That would be kind of the biggest lesson, just preparing those pipelines with local organizations in other places outside of the island.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think it's an important point to think about this mutual learning across places that may experience similar things, but then also being able to think on a very logistical level and across sectors as far as what's going to be the quickest and most effective responses. So I know we just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to wrap up this conversation. You know, as has been mentioned by many people throughout this event, earlier this month, the Biden-Harris administration announced that it's going to hold a historic White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health in September of this year. And just for context, for those who don't know, the last time that this conference was held was in 1969 under President Nixon. And that conference helped establish a lot of the current U.S. food policy framework that reduced caloric hunger and vitamin deficiencies in the U.S., and that included expansions of things like the National School Lunch Program, the Food Stamp Program, which is now SNAP, creation of the School Breakfast Program, and WIC. And so, you know, that conference had a really long-lasting impact and really shapes the world that we live in today from a food systems and food policy perspective. I'm wondering if each of you could share, you know, if you could have one thing come out of this conference that you think would be extremely effective in tackling issues of food and hunger and health, whether it's based on the work that you do or based on your understanding of different policies and programs that are effective. Can you share what you'd like to see come of this and what impact you'd like it to have? So I'll start with you, Vince.
Sure. You know, it's interesting. I think just hosting the conference and having 14 different federal agencies be tasked with preparing their own plans and objectives and their own contribution to a significant reduction of hunger by 2030 is in and of itself a significant achievement. We don't have a Department of Hunger in the United States. We have a Department of Health and Human Services, and yet most of our hunger relief programs come through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So bringing about a more coordinated and strategic framework within the federal government is going to be a significant achievement. I would say, in addition to the stated goals of the conference, Feeding America's primary additional goal would be to ensure that the voices of people who are living with hunger are elevated to a very substantial role in the conference dialogue and in the crafting of policy solutions, not just a performative presence, but an integrated way of tapping into and achieving a successful conference outcome that is informed by and sensitive to the opinions of those who actually experience and are living with hunger on a daily basis. And we're in regular contact now with the White House and strategizing about ways to ensure that outcome.
Great, thank you. Frankie?
Yeah, for me, again, very excited for this conference. And for us, luckily, this administration has really put Puerto Rico as part of its topics when it's discussing in any policy area, but especially in this one, given that Puerto Rico has a unique scenario, given its geography and demographics. So my one goal would be that Puerto Rico, when they're drafting kind of the policy recommendations, that Puerto Rico is definitely included, and voices from Puerto Rico could come in and speak about the specific necessities that are needed, they need to be focused on here.
Absolutely. And I agree with both what you, Vince, and Frankie have mentioned just about the importance of centering and prioritizing and elevating the voices of people with lived experiences of hunger and food and nutrition security. So I'll turn to you, Tara, for the last suggestion.
Yeah, again, thrilled that this conference is happening, and I think it's so important to have such a cross section of perspectives. I would say that from my vantage point, I would hope and expect that they would be thinking quite creatively about the kinds of interventions that can really make a difference on around hunger and food and nutrition insecurity, including, again, keeping that perspective of the lived experience of the folks who are encountering this, and making sure that the strategies that are being contemplated are usable and practical. And for example, I think there's tremendous excitement, including from our team, around the rollout of e-commerce and a lot of these new platforms that exist, both around SNAP, but also more broadly of just how people are getting food and different strategies to move that food to them. But that presumes a level of digital literacy, digital access, time to do the ordering. It's, you can get the food delivered, but if you're working 2 jobs and it's going to sit in the sun all day, then how helpful was that for you? So I would just say that I hope that the work that it gets down to a level of some tactical ideas, and kind of cross references the realities of people's lives with some of the solutions that are being contemplated, and kind of pressure tests those to see where they would work and who they would work for, and then if they won't, coming up with an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. Interventions and policies are only as effective as they actually align with and fit into the context of people's real lives and their daily routines and the resources that they have. So I'll just wrap up by saying that I'm really grateful for all 3 of your work and really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you about this topic, and look forward to also staying up to date with everything that your organizations and offices are doing. So I will turn it back to, I believe, Dominic for a Q&A.
Thank you, Priya. I'm actually going to turn it over now to Javier Silva, one of my colleagues on the community development team. But first, just a huge thanks to our panel that just spoke, and the first one as well. A lot of really interesting insights that we look forward to digesting, synthesizing, and figuring out where to take next. Javier, feel free to jump in next with the Q&A.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone as well, for folks in different time zones. I just want to remind the audience that there's 3 dots on the bottom of the WebEx here. And if you click on it, you'll see the Q&A tool pop up. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and we'll get to them. I want to ask Pratama if you have any questions for any of the other audience and any of the panelists that are on today. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Javier. Yes, and thank you to everyone on the panel. Both the first and the second panel was very, very interesting to hear about your work on the ground, and also just get a deeper, more nuanced understanding on how this is playing out in the US, and the tremendous work that you're doing to support to support the cause, and also to work on food security here in different parts of the US. So thanks very much, Vince, Tara, Frankie, for sharing your insights, and of course, for Priya for expertly moderating that session. I have a quick question. This is something that we get as part of the team that works on the index. We get a lot of our stakeholders, of course, are multilateral organizations, private sector companies that are looking at, thinking through how food and ag plays a role in their industry as well, but mostly from governments, policymakers that are trying to improve the food security situation in their own countries in order to really be able to support their populations achieve health and nutritional security. And so with that, one of the things that we get asked a lot is, we see different types of social protection measures and food protection measures in particular. And I know we discussed some of them, SNAP here in the US, and others, through food banks and other sort of policy measures. I guess my question maybe to Tara, Vince, even Frankie on the ground is just, based on your experience, on your on-the-ground experience, if there were one or two social protection measures that you think are absolutely critical for your communities or in supporting the cause or alleviating food insecurity on the ground, what would they be? So what would you think are those key policy instruments that on-the-ground governments need to be implementing in order to achieve this? Is it food stamps? Are there food banks, or are there general basic income protection measures that can help with achieving food security as well? So, Tara, Vince, Frankie, any thoughts?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think it's a great question. I imagine Vince in particular has some perspective and recommendations. I think for us, in our experience, being flexibility within reason, flexibility and creativity, I think goes a really long way. So the Sustain and Serve program that I mentioned, part of the reason that it's been so powerful, it's helped keep restaurants open and it's fed people and all these things, but it's also quite clear that many, if not most, of the people who are receiving these meals are SNAP recipients, and they cannot traditionally buy pre-made, prepared meals like this. So the idea of them being able to be given a hot meal, when you can't use SNAP to buy rotisserie chicken, for example, that changes the day-to-day experience of their lives. That again, it goes back to the dignity and respect and the community element of food. And I think that the ability to think creatively about how to deploy different resources and think about different potential suppliers. We've had a lot of people say to us, "Oh, well, these restaurants should just be able to. They should just be doing SNAP instead of." And that's a great idea that someone wants to contemplate, that is much, much, much easier said than done. And it isn't one or the other. But I think having the ability to test and pilot some efforts to see what works and the kind of difference that it makes is very powerful. And unfortunately, the problem is so complex that you need a lot of different solutions. So I would say in general, having the latitude to have that kind of flexibility and be realistic about people's day-to-day lives and see what works, and always having that commitment to, making sure that it's compliant and that things are being managed the right way, but also recognizing that you can take some, prudent risks to test out new strategies.
Great. Thank you, Tara. So, the White House has had taking the all government approach hands-on for the conference in September, and wanted to ask any of the panelists if they thought, what's putting that aside, what role does the private sector have here? What types of engagements have been successful, or what role do you see for hospital systems here to play a role in reducing food insecurity here in the U.S.? Maybe Vince, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. I mean, yeah, we've had some really invigorating conversations with hospital systems, with provider groups, and with insurers about partnerships around food security, because food is the most essential medicine that anyone receives, and it's really impossible to expect people to recover from trauma and disease with medications and medical interventions alone. If people come from a place of food insecurity, they're much more likely to experience serious illnesses. And if they continue or return to food insecurity when they leave the hospital, they're much less likely to recover or to remain healthy. And so you can't really be a healthcare provider without thinking about how you're integrating food security into your patient care regimen. As a CEO of a food bank, we partnered with local hospitals to create on-site pantries. We helped to create dialogue templates for interviews with patients to identify food insecure patients, discharge them from the hospital with foods that were nutritious and appropriate to their needs, and to give them connections and case management to ensure that they continue to access food resources as part of their post-hospitalization care. Type 2 diabetes is such a serious health concern in the United States, and providing people with education is great, but it works so much better when you also provide them with food and recipes, and you provide them with a supportive, nurturing environment in which they can co-create with other type 2 diabetes patients strategies for mapping out their own personal recovery plan and access to the nutritious foods that will help them achieve and implement that plan. So it's not traditionally been a part of the mathematics of patient care in the United States, much to our detriment. But I'm impressed with many of the innovative health leaders across corporate America who are responding to the challenge and in dialogue with Feeding America and other entities as to how to change the math.
Great. Great, thank you. I think with that, let me turn it over to Shannon. Shannon, thank you for joining us here today. And just want to thank everybody for participating in the panel today and joining us. Please look onto our website for more work that we're doing on food insecurity, climate resiliency and adaptation, and also household financial stability as well. So let me turn it over to you, Shannon, to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Javier, the community development team at the New York Federal Reserve, and all of our wonderful speakers and panelists today. It's my pleasure to be here and close us out. Founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress almost 30 years ago, the Congressional Hunger Center envisions a world free from hunger and poverty, where every person can achieve their full potential thanks to both equitable systems that establish financial freedom and full access to nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate foods. We need bold leaders like those we've heard from today who understand the systems that contribute to food insecurity and are capable of developing solutions and leading change in our organizations, our programs, our systems, our policies. Hunger is not an inevitable fact of nature or an escapable outcome of our society. It's an enormous problem, but it is solvable. We have all the knowledge, resources, and talent we need. And what we lack is leadership to build the public and political will to make sure it happens in our lifetimes. That's why our mission at the Hunger Center is to develop, inspire, and connect leaders in the movement to end hunger and to advocate for public policies that create a food secure world. As we've discussed today, food insecurity is a multifaceted and far-reaching problem, and the movement to end it should be too. Governments, nonprofits, corporations, educational institutions, and individuals all have a role to play, and a variety of approaches and strategies are required to solve the program at local, regional, national, and global levels. And at the Hunger Center, we believe any lasting solution to hunger must be led by people with firsthand expertise. And that's why our fellowship and our internship programs invest in the leadership of people who have experienced hunger and poverty themselves, and people of color who are disproportionately affected by hunger as the designers, implementers, and evaluations of solutions. Our fellowship and internship graduates go on and work for many of the organizations here for this conversation today. In our efforts at the Hunger Center to educate and activate a movement of hunger fighters, we often say, if you don't understand the problem, you can't solve it. You can't figure out where your skills and talents can make the biggest difference or the impact on the problem. I want to appreciate just what we've learned about the problems of global and domestic food security today. But what's the solution? What role is there for each of you and your institutions in ending global food insecurity? I remember when I joined the Hunger Center 7 years ago, the international development field was confidently promoting the UN SDG Goal 2 to end hunger by 2030. And we, like many organizations, incorporated that timeline into our strategic plan. It created a sense of urgency, achievable in our lifetime. But then the 3 C's of COVID, climate, conflict reared their ugly heads again and again and pushed more people into poverty and food insecurity, as we talked about in reviewing the Global Food Security Index trends. The 2030 goal seems out of reach. Ending hunger is often assumed to be simply too expensive, when in reality, it's well within our financial reach. Our friends at IFPRI have estimated that ending hunger by 2030 would cost about $265 billion per year. And that certainly sounds like a lot of money, but the global GDP in 2021 was more than $94 trillion. And so this means that ending hunger would cost 0.003% of global GDP. So how can you be part of the solution? Educate yourself and others about the problem and why it's important to you and should be important to them, especially your elected officials. We've heard a lot about the White House Conference on Hunger, Food and Nutrition that's happening in September. But next week, they're launching a series of regional listening sessions. They're virtual, and anyone on this call who wants to join should sign up and participate in their region and make your voices heard. Again, as we heard, the last White House conference more than 50 years ago led to some of the strong social safety net programs that we see here in our country today, and the kind of government country response we know is needed in other countries around the world if we want to address the pillars of food insecurity. If you're part of the financial sector or in government, find ways to reform and reinvest in how we produce, transport, process, trade, invest in, regulate, and consume food that address climate risks, that address the fragility of our supply chains, and that address affordability of food. And as individuals, keep donating, keep volunteering with direct service organizations like the network of Feeding America's food banks and pantries, including the one we heard from in Buffalo. But don't stop there. People coming to those food pantries need the emergency food they're receiving that day, but they also need more voices making this an issue that politicians care about and are willing to address. And lastly, use your talents and treasures also to support research organizations like IFPRI, projects like the Global Food Security Index, and advocacy organizations like the Hunger Center. Research and advocacy aren't often as emotionally compelling as donating a meal, but they are a critical part of the movement to end hunger. We're living amid a global food crisis that right now shows no signs of improvement. We've heard from our panelists about rising inflation, shortages, a doubling of severely food insecure people globally in the past 2 years, 500,000 people experiencing famine conditions. I just read yesterday that someone is dying every 48 seconds from hunger across Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. Globally, we need actions to increase fertilizer supplies and food, strengthen government-funded social safety nets, more access to international finance, more help for smallholder farmers, and better funding for humanitarian response to famine and severe malnutrition. But it's not going to happen without your voices, so please use them. And if your elected officials don't listen, then put in office some new elected officials who will, or consider running yourself. We must act now and join behind those leaders around the world who are doing their best to ring the alarm bells. We're not just talking about statistics, we're talking about real people. The lives of mothers, daughters, and sons are at stake every day. And so let's not wait until it's our own immediate family before we act. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, for your amazing work and your reflections on this event. Thanks again to every one of our speakers for your exceptional leadership and eagerness to really help us drive this conversation forward. I think it's time for the world to appreciate food for what it is. Food is infrastructure, food is medicine, food is life, and should be treated as such. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but if this message reached even a few newcomers to this conversation, I think that today was a success. So with that, have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you in the next phase of our work on this issue. Bye, everyone.